Hey guys, tonight you're kneeling in a silk robe that costs more than most people's houses. Your knees are already going numb on the tatami mats. We'll get to why your perfectly painted face is about to become a weapon in someone else's political war. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Congratulations. You've just been sold into the world of Japanese male concubinage, where beautiful young men were groomed, trained, and used as sexual objects for the entertainment of wealthy patrons. And no, this isn't some romantic tale of forbidden love. This is a brutal system that chewed up boys and spat out broken men, all while society smiled and called it culture. You're probably thinking this sounds like some underground thing, hidden in the shadows. Think again. Male concubinage was as normal as tea ceremonies in certain circles of Japanese society. From the elegant courts of the Heian period to the bustling pleasure quarters of Edo, young men were bought, sold, and rented like expensive furniture. Beautiful, breathing furniture that screamed when it broke. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. This isn't about consensual adult relationships, or even the complex dynamics of historical same-sex partnerships. This is about a systematic exploitation of young males, often starting when they were barely past childhood, trapped in a world where their bodies were commodities and their consent was irrelevant. You wake up in your small room, and the first thing you notice is how your kimono clings to your bruised skin. The silk is expensive, far nicer than anything your family ever owned, but it feels like a costume. Which, let's face it, it basically is. You're dressed to be appealing, to be consumed, to be used up and discarded when you're no longer fresh enough to command high prices. The room smells like incense and something else, something medicinal and bitter that makes your stomach turn. That's the mixture of herbs and powders they use to keep you looking young and smooth. Your skin has been scrubbed and treated with compounds that burn slightly, leaving you soft and hairless like a child, even though you're 16 and your body wants to become a man. But becoming a man isn't your job. Your job is to remain eternally boyish, eternally available, eternally willing to smile, while older men do things to your body that leave you bleeding and broken inside. The system that put you here has been refined over centuries. It's not some chaotic free-for-all. It's organized, regulated, and disturbingly efficient. There are contracts, rules, hierarchies, and even unions of sorts. The Yakuza-like groups that run the male pleasure quarters have turned human suffering into a profitable art form. Your day begins before dawn, not with meditation or breakfast, but with preparation. Your body is inspected like a horse at market. Any new bruises are covered with rice powder and rouge. Your hair is styled in ways that emphasize your youth, often with decorative pins that cost more than most families see in a year. The irony isn't lost on anyone that you're being made beautiful to be destroyed. And the preparation isn't just cosmetic. Oh, if only it were that simple. You're given substances to make you more compliant, herbs that dull pain but keep you conscious, mixtures that prevent your body from naturally defending itself. The men who run this operation have had centuries to perfect the chemistry of exploitation. You shuffle to the common area where other boys and young men are going through similar morning routines. Some are new like you, still fighting against what's happening to them. Others have been here longer, their eyes empty, moving through the motions with the mechanical precision of the thoroughly broken. A few have been here so long, they've become something else entirely. Not quite human anymore, more like expensive dolls that occasionally make noise. The hierarchy is immediately obvious. The newest arrivals get the worst treatment, the most violent clients the least food. As you survive longer, assuming you do, you might work your way up to slightly better conditions. But even the most favored concubines are still property, still disposable, still one patron's whim away from being beaten unconscious or worse. Let's talk about the clients, because understanding who these men were makes the whole system even more disturbing. These weren't desperate outcasts or social pariahs. These were respected members of society. Merchants, samurai, government officials, Buddhist monks, even married men with children of their own. Men who would go home to their families after spending hours torturing boys barely older than their own sons. The Buddhist connection is particularly twisted. Monks were some of the most enthusiastic participants in male concubinage, creating elaborate theological justifications for what was essentially organized child abuse. They claimed that relationships with young men were spiritually pure, unlike relationships with women, which were seen as contaminating. They turned rape into a religious experience, at least for themselves. Your first client arrives in the afternoon. He's a middle-aged merchant with soft hands and the kind of smile that makes your skin crawl. He pays your handlers a sum that could feed a family for months, and in return, he owns your body for the next several hours. What he does with that ownership is limited only by how much permanent damage he's willing to pay extra for. The room where it happens is decorated beautifully. Painted screens, silk cushions, delicate flower arrangements. It's designed to feel refined, cultured, artistic. As if the elegant surroundings could somehow transform what's about to happen into something other than the systematic destruction of a human being. But here's what the beautiful decorations can't hide: the way your hands shake uncontrollably before each encounter. The sound you make, somewhere between a sob and a scream, that gets muffled by silk scarves. The blood that stains the expensive fabrics and has to be scrubbed out by servants who won't meet your eyes. The physical damage is obvious and immediate. Torn skin, internal bleeding, bruises in shapes that match your client's hands and tools. But the psychological damage is more insidious. You start to dissociate, to float somewhere above your body while it's being used. You develop rituals and mental tricks to survive each encounter. You count breaths, recite poetry, imagine you're somewhere else entirely. Some boys don't make it past the first few weeks. The physical trauma is too severe, or they find ways to end their suffering permanently. Others adapt in ways that are almost worse than dying. They learn to smile convincingly, to moan at the right moments, to perform pleasure while feeling nothing but pain and revulsion. The medical care you receive is focused entirely on keeping you functional, not on your actual health or well-being. Broken bones are set so you can continue working. Infections are treated with harsh remedies that often cause more damage than they prevent. Internal injuries are ignored unless they threaten to kill you outright, and even then, the calculation is purely economic. Is it cheaper to heal you or replace you? And let's be honest about replacement. There's always a steady supply of new boys. Families sell their sons during famines. Orphans are snatched from the streets. Some are even volunteered by parents who convince themselves that this life is better than starvation. The machine that consumes young male bodies never runs out of fuel. Meanwhile, the cultural narrative around all of this is nauseating in its hypocrisy. Male concubinage is celebrated in art, literature, and theater. Poets write about the beauty of young men and the refined nature of these relationships. Artists create delicate woodblock prints showing idealized scenes that bear no resemblance to the brutal reality. The famous stories of samurai and their beautiful boy lovers are romanticized beyond recognition. What gets left out of these tales is the fact that these boy lovers were often terrified children who had no choice in the matter. The samurai code of honor apparently had some significant blind spots when it came to consent and human dignity. Of course, there are rules governing the treatment of male concubines, because even systematic abuse needs bureaucracy. Contracts specify how long you'll be bound to this life, usually between 5 and 10 years. They outline what services you're expected to provide, though the language is euphemistic enough to hide the true horror of what's being sold. The contracts also specify penalties for trying to escape or refusing clients. These penalties are designed to be worse than simply enduring the abuse, which tells you something about how creative humans can be when it comes to cruelty. Public beatings, starvation, being sold to even worse establishments, where the clientele has more violent tastes. But wait, it gets worse. The contracts aren't just about your body. They're about your entire existence. You can't own property, can't marry, can't have relationships outside of your work. You can't even eat without permission. Your diet is carefully controlled to keep you at the ideal weight and appearance for your client's preferences. Which brings us to the food situation, because even something as basic as eating becomes a nightmare in this world. You're fed just enough to stay alive and attractive, but not enough to build the muscle or body fat that might make you look too adult. The meals are bland, MEASURED portions designed by people who understand exactly how much nutrition a human body needs to function without thriving. And the type of food matters too. Nothing that might cause body odor or change your natural scent. Nothing that might give you energy or strength that could be used for resistance. Nothing that might remind you of home or normal life. Even your meals are designed to keep you compliant and available. The other boys become your only real companions, but even those relationships are complicated by the system's design. You're competing with each other for the favor of your handlers, for the less violent clients, for the small privileges that make this existence barely tolerable. Friendship is possible, but it's always tinged with the knowledge that your friend's success might mean your failure. Some of the older concubines try to help the newer ones, sharing survival strategies and warnings about particularly dangerous clients, but they have to be careful. Being caught helping someone else adapt or resist can result in punishment for both parties. The system is designed to isolate you, to make you feel like cooperation is more dangerous than submission. Let's talk about the client's preferences, because understanding what they wanted helps explain why the boys suffered in such specific ways. Youth was prized above everything else, not just physical youth, but the appearance of innocence, of vulnerability, of someone who could be corrupted and shaped. The younger and more frightened you looked, the more you were worth. Resistance was also valued, but only to a point. Clients enjoyed the process of breaking down your defenses, of turning fear into submission. But too much resistance would get you labeled as difficult, which meant being passed to clients who specialized in violent correction. It was a delicate balance between showing enough spirit to be interesting and not so much that you became a problem to be solved permanently. The economic aspect of all this is staggering when you really think about it. A single night with a popular concubine could cost what a craftsman made in months. The most beautiful and well-trained boys were investments worth more than houses. The profit margins were enormous, which explains why the system persisted for so long, despite its obvious moral problems. Your handlers track every aspect of your performance with the cold efficiency of accountants. How much each client pays, how often they return, whether they request you specifically or just accept whoever's available. Your value is calculated down to the smallest detail, and that value determines everything about your treatment. The successful concubines, the ones who survive long enough to build reputations, develop an almost supernatural ability to read clients' desires and moods. They learn to anticipate what each man wants before he asks for it, to provide exactly the right mixture of resistance and submission, fear and pleasure. It's a survival skill that comes at the cost of their own identity and autonomy. And the psychological manipulation goes beyond just surviving individual encounters. The entire system is designed to make you complicit in your own exploitation. You're told that you're special, that you're artists providing a valuable service, that your suffering has meaning and beauty. You're given small privileges that feel like gifts, but are actually just slightly less severe forms of abuse. Some boys start to believe it. They convince themselves that they've chosen this life, that they have some control over their situation, that their pain serves a higher purpose. It's a form of Stockholm syndrome that makes the system self-sustaining. The victims become invested in maintaining the very structures that destroy them. The few who manage to complete their contracts and gain their freedom face a different kind of nightmare. They're released into a society that sees them as permanently tainted, unsuitable for normal relationships or respectable work. Many end up staying in the pleasure quarters in different roles, becoming handlers or trainers themselves. The cycle continues, fed by its own victims. Others try to disappear, to create new identities and start over somewhere else. But the psychological damage follows them. They struggle with intimacy, with trust, with basic human connections. The skills they learn to survive concubinage don't translate to normal life. They're strangers in the ordinary world, carrying invisible wounds that never fully heal. The medical consequences of years in this system are horrific and permanent. Internal scarring that makes basic bodily functions painful for the rest of their lives. Joint damage from being forced into unnatural positions repeatedly. Chronic infections that never fully clear up. Nerve damage that causes constant pain or numbness. But the psychological damage is worse. These men live with trauma that has no name, no recognition, no treatment. They were systematically broken down and rebuilt as objects, then expected to somehow become human again when their usefulness expired. Many never manage the transition. They live as ghosts of themselves, going through the motions of normal life while feeling nothing inside. The social acceptance of this system is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. This wasn't happening in secret, hidden from respectable society. It was integrated into the cultural and economic fabric of Japan. Wealthy families would arrange for their sons to be trained by famous concubines as part of their education. It was seen as sophisticated, refined, an essential part of understanding pleasure and beauty. Tea ceremony masters, poets, and artists would frequent the male pleasure quarters as casually as they might visit a library or garden. The aesthetic appreciation of young male beauty was considered a mark of cultural sophistication. The fact that this beauty was achieved through systematic abuse was either ignored or rationalized away. Religious leaders not only participated, but provided theological justification for the practice. They created elaborate philosophical frameworks that transformed child abuse into spiritual enlightenment. They wrote treatises on the purity of male relationships and the corrupting influence of women. They turned their own participation in systematic rape into evidence of their spiritual advancement. Even the legal system was complicit. Laws existed to regulate the trade in male concubines, but not to protect them. These regulations were about maintaining order, preventing conflicts between buyers, ensuring tax revenue. The boys themselves had no legal standing, no rights, no recourse when they were brutalized beyond the terms of their contracts. The artistic legacy of this system is everywhere in Japanese culture, but sanitized and romanticized beyond recognition. The beautiful young men in classical paintings and literature bear no resemblance to the terrified, traumatized boys who actually lived this reality. The art preserves the aesthetic while erasing the human cost. Modern Japan has largely forgotten this aspect of its history, or at least chosen not to examine it too closely. The focus is on the artistic and cultural achievements of historical periods, not on the systematic abuse that funded and inspired much of that art. It's easier to admire the poetry and paintings than to confront the reality of how they were created. Which brings us to the boys who didn't survive, because their stories matter too, even though they're mostly lost to history. Some died from injuries inflicted by clients. others from diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of the pleasure quarters. Many from suicide when the psychological pressure became unbearable. Their deaths were rarely recorded except as business losses in account books. No names, no ages, no acknowledgement of their humanity. Just numbers representing lost investment and the need to acquire replacements. Even in death, they were reduced to economic calculations. The system had mechanisms for disposing of bodies quietly and efficiently. Arrangements with temples for anonymous burials, connections with medical schools that needed cadavers for study, remote locations where remains could be left for scavengers. The machine that consumed these boys had no interest in preserving evidence of its victims. But occasionally, someone would try to document what was happening. A monk with a conscience, a doctor who couldn't ignore the pattern of injuries, a former concubine who found the courage to speak out. These accounts were usually suppressed, destroyed, or dismissed as the ravings of mentally unstable individuals. The rare surviving testimonies paint a picture that's even worse than what can be reconstructed from official records and artistic representations. They describe a level of systematic cruelty that's almost impossible to comprehend. Not just physical abuse, but psychological torture designed to completely destroy any sense of self or autonomy. These first-hand accounts also reveal the incredible resilience of human beings under the most horrific circumstances. Boys who found ways to protect fragments of their identity, who created secret languages and hidden communities, who maintained some spark of hope despite everything that was done to them. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. But sometimes resistance took forms that the handlers couldn't predict or control. Some boys developed elaborate internal worlds, creating fantasy lives that were so detailed and immersive that they could mentally escape even while their bodies were being abused. Others found ways to inflict small acts of sabotage, spilling tea on expensive kimonos or deliberately misunderstanding instructions in ways that caused minor chaos. These tiny rebellions came with severe consequences when discovered. A boy caught deliberately damaging property might have his food rations cut in half for a week. One who spoke rudely to a client could find himself assigned to the most violent patrons for a month. But the psychological value of these small acts of defiance was enormous. They were proof, however fleeting, that some spark of autonomy still existed. The training process for new arrivals was methodical and brutal. Within hours of arriving at the pleasure house, you would be stripped and examined by men who discussed your body like butchers evaluating cuts of meat. They noted your height, weight, the color of your skin, the texture of your hair. They checked your teeth like you were a horse being sold at market. Any imperfections were cataloged for correction. A scar might be treated with expensive ointments to minimize its appearance. Crooked teeth would be filed down or pulled entirely. If you were lucky, your natural features aligned with current fashion preferences. If not, you would undergo painful procedures to reshape your face and body to match what clients wanted to buy. The physical modifications weren't limited to cosmetic changes. Your diet would be adjusted to maintain the exact body type that commanded the highest prices. Too thin and you looked sickly. Too heavy and you appeared older than your years. The balance had to be perfect, which meant constant monitoring and adjustment of every calorie that entered your body. Your voice would be trained to speak in the soft, deferential tones that clients expected. Any natural depth or authority in your speech had to be eliminated. You were taught to giggle at appropriate moments, to gasp with feigned surprise, to make the small sounds of submission that wealthy men found arousing. Your natural speaking voice was systematically erased and replaced with an artificial one designed to appeal to predators. The clothing you wore was another form of control disguised as luxury. The silk kimonos were beautiful but impractical, designed to restrict your movement and emphasize your vulnerability. The elaborate obi sashes were tied so tightly they made deep breathing difficult. Even your undergarments were chosen to create specific silhouettes and to provide easy access for clients. Your hair became a daily ordeal. The complex styles popular in male pleasure houses required hours to create and were so fragile that sleeping normally would destroy them. You learned to sleep sitting up or lying perfectly still on your back. The hair ornaments were heavy and caused constant headaches, but they were also valuable enough that losing one would result in severe punishment. The makeup process was perhaps the most psychologically damaging part of the daily routine. Layer by layer, your natural face would be painted away and replaced with an artificial one. White powder to create the pale, delicate complexion that suggested aristocratic breeding. Rouge applied to specific points to create the illusion of youthful blushing. Kohl around the eyes to make them appear larger and more innocent. But it wasn't just makeup. It was the systematic erasure of your identity. Each morning you watched in the mirror as your real face disappeared and was replaced by a mask designed to appeal to men who wanted to hurt children. The psychological impact of this daily transformation was devastating. You began to forget what you actually looked like underneath all the paint and powder. The hierarchy among the concubines was complex and ruthlessly enforced. At the bottom were the newest arrivals, boys who hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules and who made mistakes that endangered everyone's safety. They received the worst clients, the most dangerous requests, and the least protection from the house's staff. Above them were the boys who had learned to survive, but hadn't yet developed the skills to thrive. They understood how to minimize damage to themselves, but hadn't yet mastered the art of manipulating clients' emotions. They were safe from the worst abuse, but remained vulnerable to the whims of both clients and senior concubines. At the top of the hierarchy were the stars, boys who had developed such skill at reading and manipulating clients that they commanded premium prices and received special treatment. They had private rooms, better food, and some degree of choice in which clients they served. But even they were still property, still trapped, still one client's violent mood away from serious injury or death. The relationships between different levels of this hierarchy were complicated by the fact that everyone's survival depended on the system continuing to function. Senior concubines had incentives to help train new arrivals because poorly trained boys reflected badly on the entire establishment. But they also had to maintain their own privileged positions, which meant not helping too much or too obviously. Alliances formed and dissolved based on practical considerations rather than genuine affection. Two boys might protect each other during particularly dangerous periods, sharing information about violent clients or pooling resources to buy small luxuries. But the same boys might become competitors when a coveted position opened up or when a wealthy patron expressed interest in exclusive arrangements. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual relationships to encompass the entire social structure of the pleasure house. Boys were encouraged to inform on each other's rule violations in exchange for small privileges. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and suspicion that made genuine friendship nearly impossible. The staff who ran the houses were often former concubines themselves, men who had aged out of active service but remained trapped in the system. They understood exactly what the boys were experiencing because they had lived through it themselves. This should have made them more sympathetic, but often it had the opposite effect. These former concubines had survived by learning to suppress their empathy and humanity. They had become experts at emotional detachment as a survival mechanism. When they became handlers and trainers, they applied this same emotional numbness to their treatment of new boys. They weren't cruel out of sadism, but out of a learned inability to feel compassion for suffering they had once endured themselves. The business aspects of the system were managed with the same attention to detail as any other profitable enterprise. Records were kept of each boy's earnings, expenses, and performance metrics. Clients were categorized based on their spending habits, preferences, and reliability. Marketing strategies were developed to attract new customers and retain existing ones. The most successful houses employed men whose only job was to study market trends and client preferences. They analyzed which physical types were currently popular, what services were in highest demand, and how pricing should be adjusted to maximize profits. The boys themselves had no more input into these business decisions than livestock would have in determining their own sale prices. Seasonal fluctuations affected the trade in predictable ways. During festival seasons and harvest celebrations, demand increased as wealthy men had more disposable income and more excuses to indulge in expensive pleasures. During lean times or periods of political instability, prices dropped and competition between houses became fierce. The boys bore the costs of these market fluctuations directly. During boom periods, they worked longer hours and served more clients to capitalize on increased demand. During slow periods, their food rations were reduced and their living conditions deteriorated as houses cut costs to maintain profitability. The medical care provided to concubines was entirely focused on maintaining their commercial value rather than their health or well-being. A boy with a broken arm would receive treatment only if the injury affected his ability to serve clients. Internal injuries that weren't immediately life-threatening were often ignored until they became serious enough to impact earning potential. The house physicians were skilled at treating the specific types of injuries that resulted from sexual violence, but they approached these injuries as business problems rather than human suffering. They developed techniques for rapid healing that minimized visible scarring and got boys back to work as quickly as possible. Pain management was another area where commercial interests took precedence over human compassion. Boys were given just enough medication to keep them functional, but not enough to interfere with their ability to perform their duties. The goal was to maintain a careful balance between pain relief and alertness that maximized both the boys' suffering and the house's profits. The psychological effects of this medical approach were devastating. Boys learned that their pain only mattered insofar as it affected their commercial value. Their bodies were treated as machines that needed to be maintained in working order, rather than as parts of human beings deserving of care and compassion. The legal framework surrounding male concubinage was designed to protect the interests of house owners and wealthy clients rather than the boys themselves. Contracts were written in archaic language that was difficult for poorly educated boys to understand, and they were rarely given copies of their own agreements. These contracts specified not just the duration of service and types of duties expected, but also detailed penalty clauses for various forms of misbehavior. The penalties were deliberately harsh and designed to make compliance seem like the only rational choice. A boy who attempted to escape might have his contract extended by several years in addition to facing physical punishment. The contracts also included clauses that transferred certain legal rights from the boys to their owners. They couldn't own property, enter into other agreements, or even seek medical care without permission. In effect, they became legal non-persons for the duration of their contracts, with no standing to complain about their treatment or seek redress for abuse. Court records from the period show that disputes involving concubines were almost always resolved in favor of the house owners or clients. Boys who managed to bring complaints were typically punished for making false accusations, even when physical evidence supported their claims. The legal system was not just indifferent to their suffering, but actively complicit in perpetuating it. The few legal protections that existed were rarely enforced and often contradictory. Laws prohibiting the most extreme forms of violence were undermined by other statutes that gave house owners broad authority over their property. Boys theoretically had the right to refuse certain services, But exercising this right could result in contract violations that led to even worse treatment. The involvement of religious institutions in the male concubine trade added another layer of hypocrisy and justification to the system. Buddhist monasteries were among the largest consumers of these services, despite religious teachings about compassion and the sanctity of human life. Monks developed elaborate theological justifications for their participation in what was essentially organized child abuse. They argued that relationships with young men were spiritually pure because they didn't involve the contamination associated with women. They claimed that their sexual activities with boys were forms of meditation and spiritual instruction. These religious justifications weren't just empty rationalizations. They were sophisticated theological arguments that influenced broader social attitudes toward male concubinage. If respected religious leaders endorsed these practices as spiritually beneficial, it became much easier for ordinary people to accept them as normal and proper. The monasteries also served as training grounds for some of the most skilled concubines. Boys who showed particular aptitude for the intellectual and artistic aspects of the profession might be sent to monasteries for advanced education in poetry, music, and philosophy. This education made them more valuable in the marketplace, but it also exposed them to additional forms of abuse from the monks who taught them. The artistic and cultural legacy of the concubine system is visible throughout Japanese history, but it's been sanitized and romanticized to hide its true nature. The beautiful young men depicted in classical paintings and literature bear no resemblance to the terrified, traumatized boys who actually lived this reality. Famous works of art that celebrate the beauty and grace of male concubines were often commissioned by the very men who abused them. Wealthy clients would pay artists to create idealized portraits of their favorite boys, capturing them at moments of apparent happiness and contentment. These images helped perpetuate the myth that concubinage was a refined cultural practice rather than systematic exploitation. The poetry and literature of the period is filled with references to the spiritual and aesthetic value of relationships with young men. These works focus on the beauty, grace, and artistic accomplishments of concubines while completely ignoring the violence and coercion that defined their daily lives. Modern scholars who study this period often fall into the same trap, focusing on the artistic and cultural achievements while glossing over the human cost. It's easier to admire the poetry and paintings than to confront the reality that much of this artistic flowering was built on the systematic abuse of children. The economic impact of the concubine trade extended far beyond the pleasure houses themselves. Entire industries developed to support the system, from the textile workers who created the elaborate costumes to the artists who decorated the houses to the merchants who supplied exotic foods and medicines. The wealth generated by this trade flowed upward to some of the most powerful families in Japan. Many of the great merchant dynasties and noble houses had investments in pleasure, quarters that provided steady income for generations. The suffering of concubines literally built fortunes that lasted for centuries. The tax revenue generated by the trade was substantial enough that government officials had strong incentives to maintain and regulate the system rather than abolish it. Laws were written to ensure steady income streams rather than to protect the boys who generated that income. Regional governments competed to attract the most successful pleasure houses to their territories because of the economic benefits they brought. Cities with thriving concubine districts became centers of commerce and culture, drawing wealthy visitors from across the country who spent money not just on sexual services but on lodging, food, entertainment, and luxury goods. The international dimensions of the trade are less well documented, but no less disturbing. Japanese concubines were sometimes sold to wealthy foreigners or sent abroad to serve in diplomatic missions. These boys faced additional challenges of cultural isolation and language barriers on top of the usual abuse. Foreign merchants and diplomats who visited Japan often participated in the local concubine trade, bringing their own cultural attitudes and preferences that influenced how the system developed. The introduction of foreign diseases and medical practices also affected the boys, often making their already difficult lives even more dangerous. The gradual decline of the system was driven more by economic and social changes than by moral considerations. As Japan modernized and westernized in the 19th century, traditional pleasure quarters began to seem backward and embarrassing, rather than sophisticated and cultured. The rise of a merchant middle class created new forms of entertainment and social interaction that didn't depend on the systematic abuse of children. Western visitors to Japan often commented negatively on practices that had previously been sources of cultural pride, creating pressure for reform. But the decline was slow and incomplete. Even as the most visible aspects of the concubine system disappeared, many of its underlying structures and attitudes persisted in different forms. The objectification of young men and the normalization of age-inappropriate relationships continued in modified forms well into the modern era. The boys who survived the system faced enormous challenges in transitioning to normal life. Many had spent their formative years in an environment that systematically destroyed their ability to form healthy relationships or function independently. They carried psychological and physical scars that made integration into mainstream society extremely difficult. Some former concubines found work in related industries, becoming entertainers, artists, or teachers. But their past was always a source of shame and social stigma that limited their opportunities and relationships. They lived as outcasts in a society that had once celebrated their beauty while ignoring their suffering. Others struggled with addiction, mental illness, and chronic health problems that were direct results of their years in the pleasure houses. The medical knowledge and social services needed to address these problems didn't exist, leaving many former concubines to face their demons alone. The suicide rate among former concubines was extraordinarily high, though exact statistics are impossible to determine because their deaths were rarely investigated or properly recorded. Many men who had survived years of systematic abuse finally found the courage to end their suffering only after gaining the freedom to make that choice. The impact on families was also devastating. Parents who had sold their sons often lived with guilt and shame for the rest of their lives. Siblings and other relatives faced social stigma by association. The entire extended family network could be damaged by having a member involved in the concubine trade. When former concubines tried to reconnect with their families, they often found that too much time had passed and too much damage had been done. The boys who had been sold were no longer recognizable as the men who returned. The families they remembered had moved on, changed, or simply preferred not to be reminded of painful decisions from the past. The documentation that survives from this period tells only part of the story because it was written primarily by the perpetrators and beneficiaries of the system rather than by its victims. Official records focus on business transactions, legal disputes, and artistic achievements while systematically ignoring the human cost. The voices of the concubines themselves are almost entirely absent from the historical record. They were denied education, prevented from writing, and discouraged from leaving any trace of their experiences. When they did manage to record their thoughts, these documents were usually destroyed by people who had an interest in maintaining the system's positive reputation. The few surviving first-person accounts that have been discovered paint a picture that's even darker than what can be reconstructed from official sources. They describe not just physical abuse, but systematic psychological torture, designed to completely destroy any sense of personal identity or autonomy. These testimonies also reveal the incredible creativity and resilience that some boys showed in finding ways to preserve fragments of their humanity under impossible circumstances. Secret languages, hidden communities, elaborate fantasy worlds, and small acts of resistance that kept hope alive, even in the darkest moments. The modern legacy of this system is complicated by Japan's broader relationship with its historical record. Like many countries, Japan has struggled to acknowledge and address the darker aspects of its past. The male concubine trade is often omitted from historical education or discussed only in euphemistic terms that hide its true nature. This historical amnesia has real consequences for understanding contemporary issues related to sexual exploitation, child abuse, and human trafficking. The mechanisms and justifications that made the concubine system possible didn't disappear when the system itself was abolished. They evolved and adapted to new circumstances. The aesthetic and cultural elements that were used to legitimize the abuse of male concubines continue to influence Japanese attitudes toward beauty, youth, and sexual relationships. The romanticization of these historical practices makes it harder to recognize and address similar patterns of exploitation in the modern world. International awareness of this aspect of Japanese history remains limited, partly because it challenges comfortable narratives about traditional Japanese culture, and partly because the evidence has been systematically obscured or destroyed. Most people who are familiar with Japanese history know about geishas and courtesans, but have never heard of male concubines. This selective memory serves the interests of people who benefit from maintaining positive images of historical Japan, but it dishonors the memory of thousands of boys who suffered and died in the pleasure houses. Their stories deserve to be told, remembered, and understood as part of the broader human struggle against systematic oppression and exploitation. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this system to function for centuries are not unique to historical Japan. They can be found in any society where economic inequality, cultural traditions, and institutional power combine to create opportunities for the systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. Understanding how ordinary people convinced themselves that the torture and exploitation of children was not only acceptable, but culturally valuable, provides insights into how similar systems operate in the modern world. The same rationalizations, the same willful blindness, the same prioritization of comfort and profit over human dignity can be found wherever systematic abuse occurs. The boys who lived through this system were not passive victims, but active survivors who found ways to maintain their humanity under impossible circumstances. Their resilience, creativity, and stubborn refusal to be completely broken deserve recognition and respect. They were heroes in their own quiet ways, fighting battles that history has largely forgotten, but that were no less real or important for being invisible. Script continues, type continues, tut enter. The musical performances weren't just entertainment. They were auditions for more private services. Your shamisen instructor watches your fingers move across the strings, but his eyes aren't focused on your musical technique. He's evaluating your dexterity, your flexibility, how gracefully you can arch your back while maintaining the proper playing position. Every lesson becomes a preview of what clients might expect from those same hands and that same flexible spine in more intimate settings. The dance training is even more explicitly designed to prepare you for sexual service. The traditional movements you learn aren't just artistic expressions. They're carefully choreographed displays of submission and availability. The way you're taught to lower your eyes, extend your neck, present your body at specific angles. All of it designed to make you more appealing to men who view you as a beautiful object to be consumed. Your poetry lessons focus on verses about longing, submission, and the beauty of sacrifice. You memorize hundreds of lines about young men who find meaning through serving older, wiser mentors. The subtext isn't subtle. These aren't just poems. They're instruction manuals for how to think about your own situation, how to find meaning in your own exploitation. The tea ceremony training teaches you to serve with perfect grace and humility. But it also teaches you to ignore your own discomfort. You spend hours kneeling in positions that make your legs cramp and your back ache, learning to maintain a serene expression while your body screams in pain. It's excellent preparation for what clients will expect from you later. But let's talk about the hygiene requirements, because they reveal just how thoroughly your body stops belonging to you. Every morning begins with an inspection that would make a military drill sergeant seem gentle. You're examined for any signs of illness, injury, or natural bodily changes that might make you less appealing to clients. Your skin is scrubbed with abrasive cloths and harsh soaps until it's raw and bleeding in places. The goal isn't cleanliness in any normal sense. It's the complete removal of your natural scent, your individual body chemistry, anything that might remind clients that you're a real person rather than a carefully crafted fantasy. The hair removal process is excruciating and constant. Every hair below your neck must be eliminated using primitive methods that involve hot wax, sharp razors, and chemical treatments that burn your skin. The pain is intense, but complaining about it results in additional punishment. You learn to endure agony in silence, which turns out to be excellent training for what's coming next. Your teeth are filed and shaped to create the perfect smile, regardless of the damage this causes to their structure or your ability to eat normally. Crooked or discolored teeth are removed entirely, leaving gaps that affect your speech and make eating solid food difficult. But your appearance matters more than your health, and your health matters more than your comfort, and your comfort doesn't matter at all. The cosmetic modifications extend to more intimate parts of your body. Procedures are performed to ensure that your anatomy meets current fashion preferences, regardless of the pain, scarring, or long-term health consequences. These modifications are presented as beautification, but they're actually mutilation designed to make you more appealing to predators. And then there's the psychological conditioning, which is perhaps more damaging than any of the physical modifications. You're taught to view your own thoughts and feelings as obstacles to your proper function. Natural reactions like fear, pain, or revulsion are treated as character flaws that must be corrected through intensive training. The conditioning begins with simple commands that you must obey without question or hesitation. Sit, stand, kneel, smile, laugh, cry on demand. Your natural responses are systematically replaced with artificial ones designed to please clients. You learn to fake pleasure so convincingly that you sometimes forget you're faking it. More advanced psychological training involves learning to read clients' moods and desires with uncanny accuracy. You study their facial expressions, body language, and verbal cues to anticipate what they want before they ask for it. This skill is essential for survival, but it comes at the cost of your own emotional development. You're taught to suppress your own personality so completely that you become a blank slate onto which clients can project their fantasies. Your natural sense of humor, your opinions, your preferences, all of these must be hidden or eliminated. You become a perfect mirror, reflecting back whatever the client wants to see. The training also includes elaborate lessons in emotional manipulation. You learn to make clients feel special, desired, and powerful through carefully calculated displays of vulnerability and need. You practice looking helpless, grateful, and slightly afraid in ways that different types of men find arousing. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the psychological conditioning is how it makes you complicit in your own abuse. You're taught that your suffering has meaning, that you're providing a valuable service, that your pain is beautiful and worthy of celebration. You begin to take pride in your ability to endure increasingly severe treatment without breaking. The other boys in training become your primary social reference group, but these relationships are poisoned by competition and surveillance. You're encouraged to form friendships, but you're also rewarded for reporting on each other's violations of house rules. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that makes genuine human connection nearly impossible. Some boys try to form genuine bonds despite the system's design, but these relationships are actively discouraged through strategic separations and punishments. When the handlers notice two boys becoming too close, one of them might suddenly be transferred to a different house or assigned to particularly dangerous clients as a warning to the others. The few romantic relationships that do develop between boys are exploited by the handlers as entertainment for certain clients who find the spectacle arousing. Boys who fall in love might be forced to perform intimate acts with each other, while wealthy men watch and provide commentary. Their genuine feelings become just another commodity to be sold. The educational aspects of your training extend beyond music, dance, and poetry to include basic literacy and numeracy. But even these skills are taught with specific purposes in mind. You learn to read well enough to understand contracts and client requests, but not well enough to access books or information that might give you ideas about resistance or escape. Your mathematical education focuses on calculating prices, percentages, and profits. You need to understand your own economic value and how it fluctuates based on various factors. This knowledge is supposed to motivate you to maintain your appearance and skills, but it also reinforces your status as a commodity rather than a person. You're taught basic conversational skills in multiple dialects and languages, depending on the clientele your house serves. Wealthy merchants, government officials, and foreign visitors all have different linguistic preferences. Your ability to communicate with a diverse range of clients increases your market value significantly. The historical and cultural education you receive is carefully curated to support the system that's exploiting you. You learn about famous historical concubines who supposedly lived happy, fulfilled lives serving powerful men. These stories are almost certainly fabricated, but they provide models for how you're supposed to think about your own situation. You memorize poems and songs that celebrate the beauty of sacrifice and submission. You study philosophical texts that justify age-inappropriate relationships as spiritually beneficial for both parties. You learn to quote religious teachings that supposedly prove your suffering has cosmic significance. But you're not taught about legal rights you might have, historical examples of successful resistance, or alternative ways of thinking about human dignity and autonomy. The education you receive is designed to make you a more valuable and compliant product, not to develop your capacity for independent thought. The medical training you receive is focused entirely on maintaining your commercial value. You learn to recognize signs of sexually transmitted infections, not so you can seek treatment, but so you can hide symptoms from clients until they become serious enough to require professional intervention. You're taught basic techniques for treating minor injuries and managing pain without attracting attention. This knowledge helps you continue working even when you're hurt, which serves the house's financial interests, but undermines your own health and safety. The medical education also includes detailed instruction on various drugs and their effects. You learn which substances will make you more compliant, which will dull pain without affecting performance, and which will enhance certain physical responses that clients find appealing. This pharmaceutical knowledge becomes essential for survival, but it also introduces you to patterns of substance abuse that often continue long after your contract expires. You're taught to recognize the signs of pregnancy and how to terminate pregnancies using dangerous home remedies. The house can't afford to have boys unable to work due to pregnancy complications, and clients generally prefer not to be reminded that their sexual activities might have reproductive consequences. The business education you receive is perhaps the most cynical aspect of your training. You learn how the pleasure house industry operates, how prices are set, how client relationships are managed. This knowledge is supposed to help you understand your role in the system and perform it more effectively. You study the hierarchy of different types of clients and learn how to adjust your behavior based on their social status and spending habits. A wealthy merchant expects different treatment than a government official or a visiting monk. Your ability to provide customized service based on detailed client profiles increases your earning potential. You learn about marketing and promotion, how your image is crafted and sold to potential clients. You understand that every aspect of your appearance, personality, and behavior is carefully calculated to appeal to specific market segments. This knowledge makes it impossible to maintain any illusions about authentic self-expression or genuine human connection. The financial education extends to understanding debt structures and contract terms. You learn how interest rates work, how additional fees can be added to your obligations, and how various infractions can extend your period of service. This knowledge is presented as helpful information, but it's actually designed to make you feel hopeless about ever earning your freedom. Meanwhile, the living conditions in the training house are designed to reinforce your status as property rather than people. You sleep in dormitory-style rooms with minimal privacy and constant supervision. Your personal belongings are limited to a few items of clothing and basic toiletries, all of which can be confiscated as punishment for misbehavior. The food you're given is carefully portioned to maintain your ideal weight and appearance. Meals are bland and repetitive, designed to provide basic nutrition without pleasure or variety. You're not allowed to eat without permission, and requesting additional food is considered a sign of greed and selfishness. Your daily schedule is controlled down to the minute. You wake at a predetermined time, follow a strict routine of hygiene, exercise, and training activities, and go to sleep when told. There's no free time, no opportunity for spontaneous activity or personal choice. Every moment of your day is planned and supervised. The psychological impact of this complete loss of autonomy is devastating. You begin to lose track of your own preferences and desires. When every choice is made for you, you gradually forget how to make choices for yourself. This learned helplessness makes it much harder to imagine or pursue alternatives to your current situation. The punishment system used during training is designed to be both immediate and memorable. Minor infractions result in public humiliation, reduced food rations, or additional work assignments. More serious violations might result in physical punishment that leaves visible marks as a warning to other boys. But the most effective punishments are psychological rather than physical. Boys who show signs of resistance or independence might be isolated from the group, deprived of human contact for days at a time. The social isolation is often more unbearable than physical pain, and it teaches you that cooperation with the system is the only way to maintain even basic human connections. The threat of being sold to a worse establishment hangs over every aspect of training. You're constantly reminded that your current situation, however bad, could always get worse. There are places where the clients are more violent, the conditions more degraded, the life expectancy shorter. This threat keeps you compliant, even when you're suffering terribly. The graduation ceremony that marks the end of your training period is a grotesque parody of a coming-of-age ritual. You're dressed in elaborate ceremonial clothing and presented to a group of potential clients who bid on the right to be your first paying customer. The highest bidder gets to inaugurate your career as a professional victim. The ceremony is attended by the house's wealthy supporters and regular clients who treat it as a festive social occasion. They drink expensive wine, exchange gossip, and casually discuss your physical attributes while you stand silent and motionless, trying not to think about what's going to happen next. The winning bidder takes you to a specially decorated room where your virginity becomes just another commodity to be consumed and discarded. The experience is designed to be as traumatic as possible, not through sadism, but through the complete reduction of a human being to an object for someone else's pleasure. After this initiation, you're considered ready to begin serving regular clients. The training period is over, but the real nightmare is just beginning. Everything you've learned, every skill you've developed, every defense mechanism you've created will now be tested against the reality of serving men who view you as nothing more than an expensive toy. The house celebrates your graduation as a business milestone, another successfully trained product ready to generate profits. Your handlers congratulate themselves on their effective methods and begin planning the training of the next group of boys. The system continues, fed by fresh victims and sustained by a society that has convinced itself this is all perfectly normal and culturally valuable. But let's be honest about what you've actually learned during this training period. You've learned to dissociate from your own body while it's being used by others. You've learned to fake emotions convincingly enough to satisfy clients who want to believe you're enjoying their abuse. You've learned to endure pain without showing weakness and to perform pleasure while feeling nothing but revulsion. You've learned that your own thoughts and feelings are obstacles to your proper function as a sexual object. You've learned to suppress your natural responses and replace them with artificial ones designed to please predators. You've learned that resistance leads to punishment and compliance leads to slightly less punishment. Most importantly, you've learned that there's no escape from this system through normal means. The contracts are legally binding, the punishments for resistance are severe, and the social structures that might offer protection are all complicit in your exploitation. Your only hope for survival is to become so skilled at managing clients and navigating the system that you can minimize the damage to yourself while serving out your term. The psychological damage from this training period will follow you for the rest of your life. The skills you've learned for reading and manipulating people's emotions will make normal relationships difficult or impossible. The techniques you've developed for dissociating from your body will interfere with your ability to experience genuine intimacy or physical pleasure. The learned helplessness that made you compliant during training will make it hard to make independent decisions or assert yourself in normal social situations. The constant surveillance and punishment you experienced will leave you paranoid and hypervigilant even in safe environments. And the most insidious damage of all is the way you've been taught to blame yourself for your own victimization. You've internalized the message that your suffering is meaningful, that your abuse serves a higher purpose, that your pain is beautiful and worthy of celebration. These beliefs will make it almost impossible to seek help or support, even if such resources were available. The training period ends, but its effects are permanent. You've been systematically broken down and rebuilt as a product designed for consumption. The boy you were before entering the house is gone forever, replaced by a carefully crafted artifact designed to appeal to predators. The real tragedy isn't just what happened to your body during training. It's what happened to your sense of self, your capacity for hope, your ability to imagine a different kind of life. Now comes the part where you discover that everything you endured during training was just preparation for something infinitely worse. The real work begins, and with it, the full realization of what your life has become, and what it will remain until your contract expires or your body gives out completely. The training was hell, but it was hell with the promise that it would eventually end. What comes next has no such comfort. Your first real client arrives on a Tuesday afternoon, and he's nothing like what you expected. He's not some obviously predatory monster with cruel eyes and violent mannerisms. He's a soft-spoken middle-aged man who runs a successful textile business and has 3 children of his own. He treats you with polite courtesy, asks about your training, compliments your appearance in the same tone he might use to praise a well-crafted piece of furniture. This ordinariness is somehow more disturbing than obvious cruelty would be. This man goes home to his family every evening, helps his children with their lessons, discusses household matters with his wife. Then he comes here to rape boys barely older than his own sons, and he sees no contradiction between these two aspects of his life. He pays your handlers a sum equivalent to what most families live on for several months, and in return, he owns your body for the next few hours. The transaction is conducted with the same casual efficiency as buying rice or cloth. You're not a person in this exchange. You're a service being purchased, like hiring someone to clean house or repair a roof. The room where it happens has been decorated to create an atmosphere of refined sensuality. Expensive silk screens painted with scenes of cherry blossoms and flowing water. Soft cushions covered in brocade. The subtle scent of sandalwood incense burning in a bronze holder. Everything designed to make the client feel sophisticated and cultured, while he commits acts that would be recognized as torture if they were happening to someone society actually cared about. But all the beautiful decorations in the world can't disguise what's actually taking place. The way your hands shake uncontrollably as you help the client remove his clothing. The sound you make when he forces you into positions that your body isn't designed to accommodate. The taste of blood in your mouth when you bite your tongue to keep from screaming. The client seems genuinely puzzled by your obvious distress. He's paid good money for this experience, and he expects you to at least pretend to enjoy it. When you fail to perform enthusiasm convincingly enough, he becomes irritated, as if you're a defective product that isn't meeting his reasonable expectations. He doesn't see himself as a rapist or child abuser. In his mind, he's a cultured gentleman participating in a refined tradition that has ancient historical precedent. The fact that you're clearly suffering doesn't register as morally significant, because you're not really a person in his conceptual framework. You're more like an expensive musical instrument that makes unpleasant sounds when not played properly. The physical damage from this first encounter is severe, but not unusual by the standards of your new profession. Torn tissue that will take weeks to heal properly. Bruises in shapes that match the client's hands and tools. Internal bleeding that makes sitting and walking extremely painful for several days. But the psychological damage is worse. During your training, you could tell yourself that you were learning skills that might be useful someday, that you were enduring temporary hardship in preparation for something else. Now you understand that this is it. This is what all that preparation was for. This is your life now, and it will continue until your contract expires or your body gives out completely. The medical care you receive afterward is focused entirely on getting you ready to serve the next client as quickly as possible. Your injuries are treated with harsh antiseptics that cause additional pain. The healing process is accelerated using techniques that minimize visible scarring but don't address underlying damage. You're given medicines that dull the pain enough to let you function, but not enough to interfere with your ability to perform your duties. The goal is to maintain a careful balance that keeps you conscious and responsive while preventing you from being completely incapacitated by suffering. The house physician examines you with the detached efficiency of a veterinarian checking livestock. He notes your injuries in a ledger that tracks the accumulated damage to the house's inventory. Your body is depreciating like any other business asset, and these records help determine your remaining commercial value. Recovery time is minimized because every day you're not serving clients represents lost revenue. You're expected to return to work as soon as you can walk without obvious limping and speak without your voice breaking from pain. The fact that you're still bleeding internally, or that sitting causes excruciating agony, is considered irrelevant as long as you can perform your basic functions. Your second client arrives before you've fully healed from the first encounter. He's a Buddhist monk who pays extra for the privilege of being your spiritual instructor as well as your sexual user. He explains at length how your suffering is purifying your soul and bringing you closer to enlightenment. According to his theology, you should be grateful for the opportunity to transcend earthly attachments through pain and submission. This religious framework adds another layer of psychological manipulation to the abuse. You're not just being used for someone else's pleasure. You're supposedly being elevated to a higher spiritual plane through suffering. Your pain has cosmic significance. Your submission demonstrates wisdom. Your degradation is actually a form of liberation. The monk combines sexual violence with religious instruction, forcing you to recite prayers while he assaults you. He interprets your tears as evidence of spiritual awakening and your obvious distress as proof that your earthly ego is being properly dissolved. Every aspect of your suffering is reframed as evidence of progress towards some imaginary enlightenment. The theological justifications he provides are sophisticated and internally consistent. He can cite historical precedents, reference ancient texts, and provide detailed explanations for why this abuse is actually beneficial for both of you. His arguments are compelling enough that you sometimes find yourself wondering if there might be some truth to them, which makes the psychological damage even deeper. After he finishes with your body, he continues the spiritual instruction, explaining how your experience fits into broader patterns of Buddhist teaching about suffering, attachment, and liberation. He genuinely seems to believe that he's providing you with valuable wisdom along with sexual trauma. The combination of physical abuse and intellectual manipulation is particularly devastating. The monk returns regularly, always with new lessons about how your continued suffering is evidence of spiritual progress. He brings books and scrolls that he reads aloud while using your body, turning rape into a bizarre form of religious education. You learn to associate profound philosophical insights with extreme physical pain, which creates lasting psychological confusion about the relationship between wisdom and suffering. Between clients, you spend most of your time in a state of anxious anticipation. You never know when the next customer will arrive, what they'll want to do to you, or how much additional damage your body will have to endure. This constant uncertainty is almost as psychologically damaging as the actual abuse. The other boys in the house provide some companionship, but these relationships are complicated by competition and survival needs. You want to form genuine friendships, but you also need to protect yourself from being blamed for other people's mistakes or dragged down by their failures. Everyone is struggling just to survive, which makes authentic emotional connection extremely difficult. Some of the older boys try to share survival strategies and warnings about particularly dangerous clients, but they have to be careful about seeming too helpful, which could be interpreted as organizing resistance or undermining the house's authority. Even acts of basic human kindness become risky in this environment. The hierarchy among the boys is constantly shifting based on client preferences, earning potential, and favor with the house management. Your position in this hierarchy affects everything from the quality of your food to the types of clients you're assigned to serve. Moving up requires a combination of skill, luck, and willingness to sacrifice other boys' interests for your own advancement. The most successful boys develop an almost supernatural ability to anticipate and fulfill clients' desires. They learn to read micro-expressions, interpret subtle verbal cues, and provide exactly the right mixture of resistance and submission that each individual customer finds most arousing. This skill is essential for survival, but it comes at the cost of their own emotional development and sense of authentic self. Your third client is a government official who brings detailed, written instructions about what he wants you to do and how he wants you to react. The list is several pages long and includes specific phrases you're supposed to say, particular sounds you're supposed to make, and exact positions you're supposed to hold for predetermined amounts of time. Following these instructions requires you to perform a complex choreography of fake emotions while enduring genuine physical trauma. You have to smile at the right moments, gasp with feigned surprise when directed, and express gratitude for treatment that leaves you bleeding and barely conscious. The official times each phase of the encounter with a pocket watch, making notes about your performance and suggesting improvements for next time. He approaches rape with the same methodical attention to detail that he brings to his bureaucratic duties. Your suffering becomes an administrative task to be optimized for maximum efficiency. When you fail to follow his instructions precisely, he becomes irritated and adds penalty clauses to the session that extend its duration and increase its intensity. What was supposed to last 2 hours stretches into 4, then 6, as he methodically corrects each perceived flaw in your performance. By the end of this encounter, you've lost the ability to distinguish between genuine reactions and performed ones. The line between authentic emotion and calculated response has been so thoroughly blurred that you're no longer sure what you actually feel versus what you've been trained to display. The official leaves detailed feedback with your handlers about areas where your performance could be improved. This feedback becomes part of your permanent record and influences how you're marketed to future clients. Your capacity for suffering has been evaluated and scored like any other professional skill. Recovery from this third encounter takes longer because the psychological damage compounds the physical trauma. You begin to experience dissociation more frequently, floating outside your body during routine activities. Sometimes you lose hours at a time, coming back to awareness with no memory of what happened while you were gone. The house physician notes these symptoms in your medical file, but treats them as minor side effects rather than serious psychological injuries. As long as you can still function during client encounters, your mental health is considered irrelevant. The goal is to keep you operational, not to keep you sane. Your fourth client arrives while you're still recovering from the previous encounter. He's a wealthy merchant who specializes in importing luxury goods from China. He's brought expensive oils and foreign implements that he wants to use during your session together. This client is particularly interested in your pain responses. He's developed techniques for inflicting precise amounts of suffering without causing visible damage that might reduce your commercial value. He approaches torture with the same analytical mindset that made him successful in international trade. He explains his methods while he works, describing the physiological mechanisms behind different types of pain and the optimal intensity levels for creating lasting psychological impact. Your suffering becomes a science experiment, with you as both the laboratory animal and the measuring instrument. The merchant keeps detailed notes about which techniques produce which responses, building a comprehensive database of your pain tolerance and breaking points. This information will be shared with future clients who have similar interests, making subsequent encounters even more precisely calibrated to cause maximum suffering. Between the physical trauma and the clinical detachment with which it's inflicted, this encounter pushes you further toward complete psychological collapse. You begin to understand that your situation isn't temporary, that the damage being done to your body and mind is permanent, and that there's no realistic hope of escape or rescue. The merchant leaves instructions for your ongoing conditioning between visits. Your handlers implement a regimen of specific exercises and treatments designed to maintain your responsiveness to the particular types of stimulation he prefers. Even when you're not being directly abused, your body is being prepared for future abuse. Your fifth client is different again. He's a visiting dignitary from another province who wants to experience the famous pleasures of the capital city, pleasures of the capital's most exclusive establishments. He's brought his own servants and security, turning your encounter into a theatrical performance with an audience of men who watch and provide commentary on your suffering. The dignitary treats the session like a cultural experience, similar to attending a famous theater performance or visiting a renowned temple. He asks detailed questions about your training, your background, and the techniques used to maintain your appearance. You're not just being used sexually. You're being studied as an example of local craftsmanship. His servants take notes throughout the encounter, documenting techniques and responses that their master might want to recreate with boys in his own province. Your abuse becomes a learning experience that will be exported to harm other victims in distant locations. The audience aspect makes everything worse. Instead of enduring private trauma, you're performing your own destruction for the entertainment of multiple observers. They discuss your reactions, offer suggestions to the dignitary, and place small wagers on various aspects of your performance. When you fail to respond with sufficient enthusiasm, the dignitary becomes concerned that he's not getting full value for his substantial payment. He demands that additional stimulation be provided to ensure a more satisfactory experience. Your handlers comply by introducing elements that push far beyond your normal limits. The encounter stretches across an entire day and night, with breaks only when the dignitary needs to rest or eat. You're given minimal food and water to keep you conscious, but not enough to restore any real strength. By the end, you've completely lost track of time and your own identity. The dignitary leaves a generous tip and promises to return on his next visit to the capital. He also requests that you be kept available for exclusive use by visitors from his province, effectively creating a regular market for your specific type of suffering. Your sixth client arrives just 3 days later, before you've recovered from the previous marathon session. He's a young samurai who's been given access to the pleasure house as a reward for military service. Despite his youth, he's already developed sophisticated tastes in inflicting pain. The samurai approaches your abuse with the same methodical discipline he brings to martial arts training. He's studied various techniques for breaking down an opponent's resistance, and he wants to test these methods in a context where there are no rules or limitations. He spends hours working systematically through different approaches, taking careful notes about which methods produce which results. Your body becomes a training ground for techniques he might later use on prisoners of war or captured enemies. The samurai is particularly interested in psychological manipulation. He alternates between extreme violence and unexpected kindness, creating confusion about whether he's trying to hurt or help you. This emotional whiplash is more damaging than consistent brutality because it prevents you from developing stable defense mechanisms. Between sessions of physical abuse, he engages you in philosophical discussions about honor, duty, and the meaning of suffering. He explains how your experience fits into broader patterns of samurai ethics and spiritual development. Your trauma becomes a case study in warrior philosophy. The samurai returns regularly over several months, each time with new techniques he wants to test and new theories he wants to explore. Your body accumulates damage from his experiments, while your mind struggles to process the bizarre combination of violence and intellectual conversation. Your seventh client is a group booking, 3 wealthy merchants who want to share the experience and split the cost. They approach your abuse as a social activity, similar to hunting or drinking together. They take turns and offer each other advice about technique and effectiveness. The group dynamic creates additional layers of humiliation. Instead of trying to please one client, you have to manage the preferences and expectations of multiple people simultaneously. What satisfies one merchant might displease another, putting you in impossible situations where any response is wrong. The merchants treat the entire experience as entertainment, laughing and joking throughout your ordeal. They make bets about your reactions, compare their different approaches, and rate your performance like judges at a competition. Your suffering becomes a form of social bonding for them. They bring expensive food and wine, turning your abuse into a leisurely dinner party with live entertainment. They eat and drink while using your body, occasionally offering you scraps as if you're a pet performing tricks for treats. The session lasts most of the night because the merchants are in no hurry to finish. They're enjoying themselves too much to be efficient. For them, this is a rare treat, and they want to savor every moment. For you, it's an extended nightmare that seems like it will never end. By your 8th client, you've begun to develop more sophisticated dissociation techniques. You've learned to float completely outside your body during the worst moments, watching what happens to you as if it's happening to someone else. This mental escape makes the physical trauma more bearable, but also accelerates your psychological fragmentation. This client is a famous poet who wants to incorporate your reactions into verses he's composing. He brings writing materials and stops periodically to capture particularly eloquent expressions of pain in carefully crafted language. The poet approaches your abuse as artistic inspiration. He's genuinely moved by the aesthetic beauty he finds in your suffering, and he wants to preserve that beauty in permanent literary form. Your trauma becomes raw material for art that will outlive both of you. He reads his compositions aloud while continuing to hurt you, creating a surreal soundtrack of beautiful language describing ugly realities. The contrast between the elegant poetry and the brutal actions it describes creates additional psychological confusion. The poet explains how your experience connects to classical traditions of beautiful suffering in literature. He cites historical examples and theoretical frameworks that supposedly give meaning to your pain. Your abuse becomes part of a grand artistic tradition stretching back centuries. He promises to include you in his next published collection, immortalizing your suffering in verse that educated people will appreciate for generations. You're offered a kind of literary immortality in exchange for enduring trauma that will destroy your capacity to appreciate poetry or beauty. Your ninth client brings medical equipment and wants to conduct experiments on pain tolerance and physical response. He's a physician who's developed theories about the relationship between pleasure and suffering that he wants to test on human subjects. This encounter combines sexual abuse with medical torture. The physician uses precise instruments to inflict carefully measured amounts of damage while monitoring your vital signs and recording your responses. Your rape becomes a research project. He explains his hypotheses while he works, describing the physiological mechanisms he's studying and the potential applications for his research. Your suffering might contribute to medical knowledge that could help people in the future, though it's more likely to just satisfy his personal curiosity. The physician takes detailed measurements throughout the session, creating charts and graphs that document your declining condition. Your deterioration becomes data in a scientific study that will never be published or shared with anyone who might actually help you. He photographs your injuries for his research records, creating permanent documentation of your abuse that he'll keep for future reference. Years from now, he might show these images to colleagues or students as examples of interesting physiological responses. By your 10th client, you've stopped trying to keep track of the specific details of each encounter. The individual acts of abuse blur together into a continuous nightmare, punctuated by brief periods of unconsciousness or dissociation. This client is unremarkable except for his efficiency. He's a regular customer who knows exactly what he wants and how to get it with minimal conversation or preparation. He uses your body like a familiar tool, with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this many times before. The encounter is over relatively quickly, but the psychological impact is perhaps worse than the more elaborate sessions. The routine nature of the abuse, the client's casual familiarity with your body, the sense that this is just another ordinary transaction for him while being a traumatic violation for you. After he leaves, you sit in the recovery room trying to remember who you were before this all started. But those memories are becoming increasingly vague and distant. The boy who entered this place seems like a different person entirely, someone you might have known once, but can barely remember now. The cumulative damage from these encounters is beginning to affect your basic cognitive functions. You have trouble concentrating, difficulty forming coherent thoughts, problems with memory and perception. Your handlers note these changes, but only as they affect your market value. Your body is also showing signs of serious wear. Chronic pain has become your normal state. Internal injuries that were never properly treated have created ongoing health problems. Your appearance, despite constant cosmetic maintenance, is beginning to show the effects of systematic abuse. The house physician recommends reducing your client load to preserve your remaining commercial value. But the financial pressures of running the establishment mean that these medical recommendations are often ignored in favor of maximizing short-term profits. Your 11th client requests a multi-day exclusive arrangement. He's a wealthy collector who wants to add you to his private collection for an extended period. This means leaving the relative security of the house for an unknown environment where there will be no witnesses to whatever happens to you. The collector's estate is isolated in the mountains, far from any other human habitation. His staff consists of servants who are either complicit in his activities or too frightened to interfere. You're completely at his mercy, with no possibility of rescue or escape. He's converted part of his mansion into a private pleasure complex with specialized rooms designed for different types of activities. Each room contains equipment and furnishings specifically chosen to facilitate particular forms of abuse. You're given a tour like a guest being shown around a luxury hotel. The collector explains that you're the latest addition to his personal museum of beautiful objects. He has rooms full of art, rare books, exotic plants, and now you. You're displayed alongside priceless artifacts as another example of his refined taste and unlimited resources. For the next month, you exist solely for his entertainment. There are no other clients, no scheduled sessions, no breaks in the routine. You're available continuously for whatever activities he decides to pursue. The intensity of focus on your suffering creates new depths of psychological damage. The isolation is particularly devastating. In the house, there were other boys who shared your experience and could provide some minimal human connection. Here, you're completely alone with your abuser and his silent servants, who avoid eye contact and pretend not to notice your condition. The collector has sophisticated tastes and extensive experience with breaking down resistance. He uses a combination of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and intermittent kindness to create a complex web of dependence and terror that makes escape emotionally impossible, even when it's physically feasible. By the time you return to the house, you've been fundamentally changed. The damage goes beyond physical injuries to include profound alterations in your personality, perception, and capacity for human connection. You're technically the same person, but every meaningful aspect of your identity has been restructured. Your 12th client is a foreign merchant who doesn't speak the local language well. Communication is limited to gestures and simple commands, which creates a surreal atmosphere where your abuse happens without words. The silence makes everything feel more intense and isolated. Without verbal communication, the client relies entirely on physical cues and your reactions to guide his activities. This means he pays extremely close attention to every sound you make, every change in your breathing, every involuntary movement. You become hyper-aware of your own responses because they're the only form of communication available. The language barrier also means you can't use verbal techniques that might help manage the situation. You can't negotiate, explain, or request modifications to what's happening. You're reduced to purely physical existence without the possibility of intellectual or emotional engagement. The client seems frustrated by the communication difficulties and compensates by being more aggressive in his physical approaches. When words fail, he relies on force to ensure compliance. The encounter becomes more violent than it might have been with someone who spoke the same language. Your 13th client brings a painter who wants to create portraits during your session. The artist sets up an easel and works throughout the encounter, capturing different moments and expressions in detailed sketches and paintings. This transforms your abuse into a performance art piece. Every moment of pain becomes a potential subject for artistic representation. You're conscious not just of your own suffering, but of how that suffering looks to an observer, how it might be interpreted and preserved in permanent form. The painter offers artistic commentary throughout the session, discussing composition, lighting, and emotional expression. Your trauma becomes an aesthetic experience for the observers, who seem genuinely moved by the beauty they find in your pain. The finished artworks will be displayed in private galleries, where wealthy collectors can appreciate the sophisticated portrayal of suffering. Your abuse becomes part of an artistic legacy that will outlive your own destroyed body and mind. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. Your 14th client is a tea ceremony master who insists on conducting an elaborate ritual before and after using your body. He spends an hour preparing the perfect cup of tea, explaining each step in excruciating detail, while you kneel naked on the cold floor, waiting for him to finish his cultural performance. The irony isn't lost on you that this man who devotes such care and attention to the proper preparation of leaves in hot water treats your body like a disposable napkin. He can discuss the spiritual significance of water temperature for 20 minutes, but sees nothing contradictory about raping a child immediately afterward. The tea ceremony becomes a form of psychological torture in itself. You're forced to remain perfectly still in uncomfortable positions while he performs his elaborate ritual. Any movement or sign of impatience results in starting the entire ceremony over from the beginning. After the tea is finally prepared to his satisfaction, he makes you drink it while he explains its history and cultural significance. The hot liquid burns your empty stomach, but showing discomfort would be interpreted as disrespecting the tea master's expertise and artistic vision. Only after the cultural education is complete does he begin the sexual assault, approaching your body with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to preparing the tea. Every movement is deliberate and precisely calculated to create maximum impact. Meanwhile, your handlers are already preparing your next encounter. The scheduling is relentless because every hour you're not serving a client represents lost revenue. Your body becomes a business asset that must be utilized as efficiently as possible to justify the investment in your training and maintenance. Your 15th client arrives while you're still bleeding from the tea master's attention to detail. This one is a young noble who's celebrating his coming of age by experiencing all the adult pleasures his status can buy. You're his introduction to the sophisticated world of purchased suffering. The young noble approaches the encounter with the enthusiasm of someone trying an exotic new food. He's heard stories about the pleasure houses from older relatives and wants to understand what all the excitement is about. Your trauma becomes his educational experience. He asks constant questions throughout the session, wanting to understand the techniques and responses he's witnessing. Your abuse becomes a learning opportunity where he gains knowledge about human suffering that will serve him well in his future role as a person with power over others. The noble takes notes afterward, recording his impressions and reactions for future reference. He's treating the entire experience like a cultural event that deserves careful documentation. Your pain becomes material for his personal memoirs. He promises to return regularly as he develops more sophisticated tastes and greater understanding of the art involved. You've become part of his ongoing education in the exercise of power over vulnerable people. Your 16th client is a group of traveling merchants who pool their money for a shared experience. They approach your abuse as a business meeting where they can discuss trade opportunities while enjoying expensive entertainment. They talk about shipping routes and profit margins while taking turns with your body. Their casual conversation continues throughout the encounter as if your background, music rather than a human being experiencing trauma. The merchants offer each other advice about technique and efficiency, sharing knowledge gained from similar experiences in other cities. Your suffering becomes part of their professional development and networking activities. They compare the quality of service in different establishments, rating your performance against boys they've used elsewhere. Your abuse becomes part of a larger market research project as they evaluate the pleasure industry across multiple regions. By your 17th client, you've developed a strange form of professional pride in your ability to endure increasingly severe treatment without completely breaking down. This psychological adaptation is perhaps more disturbing than the original trauma because it represents your mind's attempt to find meaning in meaningless suffering. This client is a military commander who approaches your abuse like a tactical exercise. He's developed strategies for breaking down resistance that he wants to test in a controlled environment before applying them to captured enemies. Your body becomes a training ground for interrogation techniques and psychological warfare methods. The commander takes detailed notes about which approaches produce which results, building a database of information that will be used to torture prisoners of war. The session is filmed using early photographic equipment, creating permanent records that will be studied by other military personnel. Your suffering becomes educational material for an entire generation of officers learning how to break human beings. The commander explains that your experience is contributing to military science and national defense. Your trauma has been reframed as patriotic service, making resistance seem not just futile, but actually treasonous. Your 18th client brings his teenage son, who's learning the family business. The boy watches while his father demonstrates proper technique, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification about specific methods. This generational transfer of abuse techniques ensures that the system will continue indefinitely. The son is learning not just how to hurt people, but how to think about human suffering as normal and acceptable. The father explains the business aspects of the transaction, teaching his son about pricing, quality assessment, and vendor management. You're not just being abused. You're being used as a case study in human trafficking economics. The son takes his own notes and asks if he can try some of the techniques himself under his father's supervision. Your abuse becomes a father-son bonding activity that will create lifelong memories for both of them. Your 19th client is a famous artist who wants to create a series of sculptures based on your physical responses to different types of stimulation. He brings clay and measuring tools, working while he hurts you to capture the exact proportions of your suffering. The artist explains his vision for a permanent installation that will preserve the beauty of your pain in lasting form. Your trauma becomes raw material for artworks that will be displayed in galleries and admired by cultured audiences. He takes detailed measurements of your body under different conditions of stress and damage, creating precise records that will inform his sculptural work. Your suffering becomes technical specifications for artistic production. The finished sculptures will be sold to private collectors who appreciate the sophisticated portrayal of human anguish. Your abuse becomes a commodity in the art market, generating profits long after your body has been destroyed. Your 20th client requests a custom scenario based on his personal fantasies. He's written a detailed script that you're expected to follow, complete with specific dialogue and emotional responses that must be performed convincingly. The script involves multiple costume changes and elaborate role-playing that requires you to portray different characters throughout the encounter. Your abuse becomes a theatrical performance with you, as the sole actor in a play written by your abuser. When you fail to deliver lines with sufficient conviction, the client becomes frustrated and demands multiple takes until you get it right. Your trauma becomes a creative process where artistic vision takes precedence over human suffering. The client records the entire performance for his personal collection, creating a permanent archive of your degradation that he can enjoy repeatedly. Your abuse becomes entertainment content that will provide him with pleasure long after the initial encounter. By your 21st client, you've begun to lose track of your own identity entirely. The constant role-playing and performance demands have made it difficult to distinguish between your authentic self and the various characters you're forced to portray. This client is a wealthy widow who uses male concubines as replacements for her deceased husband. She's created an elaborate fantasy where you represent her lost love, and she expects you to play the role convincingly. The psychological demands of this encounter are particularly complex because you must simultaneously submit to abuse while portraying a loving relationship. The emotional confusion this creates is more damaging than straightforward violence. The widow genuinely believes she's recreating beautiful memories with her husband, and she becomes upset when your obvious suffering interferes with her fantasy. Your trauma becomes an obstacle to her emotional healing. She pays for extended sessions where you're expected to maintain the loving husband persona for days at a time. The psychological strain of sustained role-playing while enduring abuse creates new forms of mental breakdown. Your 22nd client is a religious scholar who's writing a treatise on the spiritual benefits of suffering. He conducts interviews with you between sessions of abuse, gathering material for his theological arguments. The scholar explains how your experience illustrates important religious principles about purification through pain and transcendence through submission. Your trauma becomes evidence in sophisticated theological arguments. He takes detailed notes about your psychological responses, using your breakdown as case study material for his academic work. Your suffering becomes research data that will support religious justifications for similar abuse. The finished treatise will be used to train other religious leaders in the proper understanding of pain and submission. Your trauma becomes educational content that will influence religious thought for generations. Your 23rd client brings medical students who want to observe the physiological effects of extreme stress on the human body. Your abuse becomes a teaching demonstration for future physicians. The students take notes throughout the encounter, documenting your responses and asking questions about the medical aspects of what they're witnessing. Your suffering becomes curriculum content in medical education. The professor explains how your reactions illustrate important principles of anatomy and physiology that the students need to understand. Your trauma becomes a learning opportunity disguised as scientific inquiry. The medical knowledge gained from studying your abuse will supposedly help the students become better doctors, though it's more likely to make them more effective at inflicting suffering on future patients. Your 24th client is a foreign diplomat who wants to experience local culture during his visit. He approaches your abuse as a form of cultural tourism, similar to visiting famous temples or attending traditional performances. The diplomat asks detailed questions about the historical development of male concubinage in Japan, treating your suffering as an anthropological subject worthy of academic study. Your trauma becomes cultural education. He takes extensive notes about the experience to share with colleagues back home, spreading knowledge about Japanese abuse techniques to other countries. Your suffering becomes cultural exchange material. The diplomat expresses genuine appreciation for the sophisticated approach to human degradation that Japanese culture has developed. Your trauma becomes a source of national pride that enhances international relations. Your 25th client requests a multi-week exclusive arrangement that will take you away from the house entirely. You're transported to a remote estate where you'll exist solely for one person's entertainment with no witnesses or oversight. The isolation is complete. There are no other boys to provide companionship, no staff members who might show sympathy, no regular routines to provide structure. You exist in a void where the only human contact involves your systematic destruction. The client has unlimited time and resources to explore the full range of human suffering, without the constraints of scheduled sessions or shared facilities. The abuse escalates to levels that would be impossible in the regular house environment. The psychological impact of complete isolation compounds the physical trauma. You begin to lose track of time, identity, and reality itself. The boundaries between yourself and your abuser start to blur as he becomes your only source of human interaction. When you finally return to the house, you're no longer the same person who left. The extended isolation and concentrated abuse have created fundamental changes in your personality and perception that will never fully heal. Your 26th client is a collector of rare experiences who has traveled, extensively seeking unusual forms of entertainment. He approaches your abuse with the enthusiasm of someone checking items off an exotic bucket list. The collector has detailed knowledge of abuse techniques from different cultures and wants to test their effectiveness on you. Your suffering becomes a comparative study in international torture methods. He documents the entire encounter for his personal archives, creating detailed records of cultural differences in approach to human degradation. Your trauma becomes anthropological research material. The collector plans to write a book about his experiences, sharing knowledge about global abuse techniques with interested readers. Your suffering becomes content for travel literature, aimed at wealthy sadists. Your 27th client brings a team of researchers who are studying the psychological effects of systematic abuse. They conduct interviews and psychological tests before, during, and after your encounter. The researchers explain that your experience will contribute to scientific understanding of trauma and resilience. Your suffering becomes data in legitimate academic research that will be published in scholarly journals. They use standardized psychological assessment tools to measure your deterioration, creating precise documentation of how systematic abuse destroys human personality. Your breakdown becomes scientific evidence. The research findings will supposedly help develop better treatments for abuse victims, though the knowledge gained by studying your destruction could just as easily be used to make future abuse more effective. Your 28th client is a wealthy industrialist who owns factories throughout the region. He uses the same methodical approach to your abuse that made him successful in business, treating your suffering as a production process to be optimized. The industrialist times different phases of the encounter, looking for ways to maximize efficiency and minimize waste. Your trauma becomes a business problem to be solved through better management techniques. So there you have it. The systematic destruction of human beings, disguised as culture, wrapped in silk and sold as sophistication. Thousands of boys fed into a machine that turned suffering into profit and called it art. The system eventually faded away, but not because anyone suddenly developed a conscience. It just became less fashionable, less profitable, less convenient. The boys who survived carried their scars into obscurity, and history politely forgot about the whole ugly business. Pleasant dreams.